The founding of Arnor and Gondor was a time of great building projects, and from the old Númenórean colonies arose many great cities: Annúminas, Fornost, Minas Anor, Osgiliath, Minas Ithil. But there was one city that was there before them all, and would be there after them with the exception of Minas Anor, a city that played an important role in Gondor's history, and at one point was even being considered as the capital. In this video, we talk about Pelargir, Gondor's first city. If you look at a map of Middle-earth, you can see the city of Pelargir in southern Gondor, in the region of Lebanon, right where the river Sirith meets the far larger Anduin. Despite being reasonably far inland, the Anduin is still fairly wide where Pelargir is located. But fun fact, Pelargir was not always this far from the coast. It was actually much closer during the First and Second Age, but during the downfall of Númenor, the coasts retreated as a result of the cataclysm, and thus Pelargir found itself much further inland. It's possible that the first residents of the area were Nandorian elves, because we're told that they did dwell by the mouths of the Anduin during the First and early years of the Second Age. The first residents we are certain of would have been the pre-Númenóreans, who dwelt through much of Gondor, Rohan, and southern Eriador. Our first record of Númenórean interest in the Bay of Belfalas area was in 735 of the Second Age. Prince Aldarion of Númenor sailed around the Cape of Andrast, and is mentioned as visiting the area that would later become Dol Amroth. It's possible that Aldarion did sail a little further, and even spotted the site where Pelargir would eventually be built. While Vignalonde, the first Númenórean haven, was constructed in Enedwaith between 750 and 800, there doesn't seem to have been expansion beyond that until the year 1200. It's likely around this time when the first Númenórean settlers arrived in Gondor, and possibly at Pelargir itself. Certainly there was quite a Númenórean presence in the area around 1600, because when Sauron was gathering an army to go to war with the elves, he was specifically trying to conceal it from the Númenórean outposts in the region to maintain the element of surprise. The colonization efforts only increased following the War of the Elves and Sauron, which was won in large part to Númenórean intervention. With Taratanamér of Númenor taking the throne in 2029, a growing divide in Númenórean society caused a divide in Middle-earth. Those settling north of the Anduin were from a group that would later be known as the Faithful, those Númenóreans who maintained friendship with the Elves and the Valar. The King's Men, a group increasingly defined by a desire for power and for hostility towards the Elves, mostly settled south of the Anduin. As for the pre-Númenóreans who were already dwelling in Lebanon, well, their fates don't seem to have been uniform. Some of these groups were actively aligned with Sauron, so they didn't exactly get along well with the faithful colonists. These groups were often pushed out of their lands, and many of them ended up in the White Mountains. A particularly powerful group called the Men of the Mountain still remained at the end of the Second Age. Other groups were integrated by the Númenóreans, and from the beginning to the end of Gondor, many of the men of Lebanon shared a mixed heritage, from both the Númenóreans and the pre-Númenóreans. By 2350 of the Second Age, the Númenórean colonies were large enough and important enough for a proper city to be founded, and this was Pelargir. As Númenor darkened and the increasingly persecuted faithful fled in greater numbers, Pelargir and the surrounding lands became all the more important. Around the time Ar-Pharazôn became king of Númenor, Sauron started actively attacking the Númenórean cities along the coast. It's possible that Pelargir was amongst these. But Sauron was captured and taken back to Númenor, and as the story goes, he corrupted and deluded Númenóreans into attacking Valinor, leading to the downfall of Númenor. As mentioned earlier, this was when Pelargir suddenly found itself much further from the coast. Escaping from the downfall of Númenor was Elendil and his two sons, Isildur and Anarion. These two possibly even landed at Pelargir itself, and decided that the Númenórean colony in the region should become a kingdom of its own, Gondor. Pelargir, however, was not to be the capital. Gondor seemingly had enough people for several more major cities at this point, so Isildur founded Minas Ithil, Anarion founded Minas Anor, and together they founded Osgiliath at the narrow point of the Anduin. But this did not cause Pelargir to decline in importance. It was still Gondor's greatest port, far larger than Harlond, which was established just to the south of Minas Anor and Osgiliath. Pelargir played a fairly minimal role through the rest of the Second Age and the early years of the Third Age, but that changed with the coming of the Ship Kings. The first of these was Taranon Falastur, who ruled between 830 and 913 of the Third Age. He became famous for conquering new lands south and west of the Anduin, so possibly Horondor and western Gondor such as Anfalas. He loved the sea, so he built a house in Pelargir, its foundations being built into the river. The construction of a solitary house was nothing compared to the grand renovations of Eärnil I, Taranon's nephew, who ruled between 913 and 936. He repaired the port of Pelargir and began construction of a great navy, which he used to conquer Umbar in 933. Unfortunately for Eärnil, him and much of his fleet were lost in a storm in 936. So, in Pelargir, the shipbuilding continued under his successor, Kiriandil. The fleet of Kiriandil and his son, Jarmendikil I, were instrumental in Gondor defeating the Black Númenóreans and the Haradrim, and conquering vast lands in Harad. Gondor's attention then turned away from the south, and Pelargir and the navy faded away from the history books for a while, until the rise of Castamir the Usurper. A great-grandson of King Calmakil, Castamir was born in 1259 and became captain of the ships sometime during the reign of King Valacar, who ruled between 1366 and 1432. Valacar's reign was a time of instability. The increase of Northmen serving in Gondor's armies and then settling in Gondor was not well liked by some of the nobility. Also, Valacar's son and heir, Eldacar, was of half Northman descent, and with Gondor having spent several centuries focusing on its land frontiers in the east, there may have been the feeling of neglect amongst Gondor's navy and its coastal provinces. So when Eldacar became king in 1432, Castamir rose against him and Pelargir joined his cause along with many of the coastal provinces. After 5 years, Eldacar was defeated and fled into the north, Castamir taking the crown of Gondor. Castamir immediately proved to be a very divisive leader. He was hated in the inland provinces of Anorion, Ithilien and Calanadon, not just for neglecting them and seemingly only caring for the fleets, but for his brutal, unnecessary sack of Osgiliath following Eldacar's defeat. But along the coast he proved to be quite popular, especially in Pelargir, which he planned on making the new capital, much to the dislike of those who dwelt inland. But Castamir's popularity continued to decline, and it ended up playing a role in his downfall. In 1447, Eldacar returned at the head of an army of Northmen, and many people across inland Gondor were all too eager to join him. A bloody battle was fought at the crossings of Erwi on the road to Pelargir, and Castamir was slain by Eldacar himself, his army defeated. However, this was not the end of the usurper's legacy. The remnants of his supporters, including his sons, fled to Pelargir where they were besieged by Eldacar, but the siege was ultimately ineffective because Eldacar could not cut off the city from the sea. This is because the fleet was mostly loyal to Castamir. In the aftermath of Castamir's defeat, many sailors joined the defense of the city, and those who were abroad swiftly returned. By 1448, feeling that they had established all of the support they could, the sons of Castamir then used the fleet to escape Pelargir, sailing south to Umbar where they established a rival lordship. Eldacar then managed to retake the city, but it was a hollow prize. He had few, if any, ships remaining, and few, if any, sailors to man them. He could do nothing against the rebels in Umbar, who would become the first iteration of the Corsairs of Umbar. If the rest of Gondor had any hard feelings towards Pelargir for playing a central role in Castamir's rise and the escape of his supporters, it isn't told. Realistically, the rest of Gondor couldn't afford to hold any grudges, because the loss of Umbar and the establishment of the Corsairs made Pelargir more important than ever. Because the loss of the fleet, the sailors, and the expertise showed. Over the next 2 centuries, Gondor battled Harad and Umbar on land, and while they did win victories there, they could not match the Corsairs at sea. The direness of the situation became apparent in 1634. The great-grandsons of Castamir, Angamaite and Sangahyando, learned that King Menardil of Gondor was present in Pelargir. They sailed into the Bay of Belfalas unopposed and launched a surprise raid on the city, sacking it, slaying King Menardil, and sailing off with a huge amount of loot. This enraged Telemnar, Menardil's son, and he immediately got to work building a fleet that could rival Umbar's. Unfortunately for him, his work came to a screeching halt merely 2 years later, as the Great Plague ravaged Gondor, killing him and all of his children. It wasn't until the reign of Telúmatar, which began in 1798, when Gondor built a new fleet, presumably in Pelargir. Tulumatar then used this fleet to surprise the Corsairs. His forces stormed Umbar in 1810 and slew the last descendants of Castamir. While Gondor managed to hold Umbar for the 40 remaining years of his reign, the city was lost soon afterwards when the Wain Riders attacked Gondor from the east. Speaking of the Wain Riders, during their invasion of 1944, alongside the forces of Harad, it was at Pelargir where Gondor's southern army was headquartered. This army, led by General Eärnil, soon to be King Eärnil II, defeated the Haradrim and then also ambushed and defeated the Wain Riders. After this, we don't hear much more of Pelargir. It presumably remained the headquarters of Gondor's fleet, but this fleet seems to have become weaker and smaller over time, as Gondor was forced to focus more on the Anduin frontier. It was also the headquarters of Gondor's southern army until 2510. After that, the northern southern army system ended. Following the Watchful Peace, which ended in 2460, the Corsairs frequently raided Gondor and even launched a large-scale invasion in 2758. It's possible that Pelargir was attacked during these raids and invasions, thus making it incredibly important for the defense of southern Gondor. But Pelargir still proved to be important for whenever Gondor went on the offensive. When Aragorn, serving as Thorongil, raided Umbar and burnt their fleet in 2980, his raiding fleet was launched from and returned to Pelargir. During the War of the Ring in 3019, what was left of Gondor's fleet seems to have engaged the Corsairs of Umbar to no avail. Then, sometime between the 10th and 13th of March, the Corsairs attacked Pelargir and took the city. We know nothing of the battle, how long the city had held out, how much damage had been done to it, and how long the Corsairs had been sitting there with their fleet of 50 large ships. All we do know is that on the 13th, Aragorn, leading the forces of southern Gondor, and more importantly, a host of Oathbreakers, attacked the Corsairs and Haradrim in the city. Deathly afraid of the Oathbreakers, the Southrons put up hardly any resistance, the city was retaken, and the fleet was captured. Aragorn then spent that night at Pelargir preparing the fleet and gathering more forces to him, before setting out on the morning of the 14th to Minas Tirith. With Mordor defeated, Pelargir probably once again grew in importance in the early 4th Age. After all, we're told that King Elessar did war against some of the Haradrim, and we're told that he subdued Umbar. Whether this means conquering Umbar or simply diplomatically dealing with them, it's unknown, but either way, he probably would have needed a fleet to do so. Unless Umbar was taken, Pelargir probably remained Gondor's primary port for many years to come. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you wish to visit Pelargir, you can in, you guessed it, the Lord of the Rings Online. You can help Aragorn retake it because your character has the ability to be everywhere at once, and you can later visit it after Sauron has been defeated. It's actually quite nice. If you wish to visit Pelargir in real life, I recommend visiting Venice. Yep, Venice, because that's the city that Tolkien associated Pelargir with. Cheers, farewell, and remember, I'm not ashamed to admit that it took me years to realize that Pelargir had 2 R's in it.